Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Habarigani. This is Sister Thage welcoming you to the liberated zone of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist and internationalist world affairs program with a historical analysis and a jazzy music mix. We are in Fund Drive and will still bring you a packed program, with our central theme today of slavery and resistance. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Oliver Baker, assistant professor of English and African American Studies at Pennsylvania State University and author of the book No More Peace, Abolition, War, and Counterrevolution. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. David Eltis, the Robert Woodruff Professor Emeritus of History at Emory University in Atlanta, an adjunct professor at University of British Columbia in Canada, and author of the book Atlantic Cataclysm, Rethinking the Atlantic Slave Trades. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Kenny Barron, Herbie Hancock, Ahmad Jamal, Stephen Harris, and more. So sit back, phone in to pledge, and as our brother Gary Baca is about to highlight our fund drive this hour, as always we stand ready for revolution. Take it away, Gary.
You are listening to Freedom Now. Freedom Now is a Pan-African internationalist world affairs program supporting all indigenous and oppressed peoples worldwide. 818-985-5735. If you support this program, we support the right to self-determination and seek to provide another point of view, devoid of mainstream media. 818-985-5735. If you support this type of programming with the great Gerald Horne, pledge online at kpfk.org. If you've learned something, if you got something out of today's show, or you've been listening in the past, 818-985-5735. And our sis Tej, Freedom Now, shout out to her for producing this show. And as always, we stand ready for revolution. And that's the motto right here at Freedom Now with Gerald Horne, heard here every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. 818-985-5735. And think about it. If you pledge at any amount, you become a member at $25. You can pledge $50 for this program, $100 for this program, but you keep this program on the air, which is important that we keep voices that are oppressed, that are going through the struggle and not acknowledged. Indigenous people, immigration rights, and immigration issues. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. We are in our spring fund drive, and what that means is we raise money, and we're good for about a couple of months here at KPFK. But after that, we're back in the struggle again, trying to make it work, trying to make it happen. We really don't have a big staff here. We have a skeleton staff, but what your money goes to is making sure that we keep the airwaves on, that we have the transmitter working so that we can have voices that come on the air, non-paid voices. They don't have a premeditative agenda. It's what's going on in the streets and what we feel. Hands off our democracy. That's the word. Just recently we broadcasted Fighting Oligarchy Tour with Bernie Sanders and AOC. And it was a success. And a lot of us showed up, were there, and a lot of us were KPFK listeners. 818-985-5735. Get yourself a bumper sticker or a tote bag at $50. Or ask the phone room what you can get as a gift. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Before we go back to the show, we just want to remind you that In order for us to bring you these types of programming, we ask for your donation during this spring fund drive so we can stay on the air. And we can't help but stress that. It's just as simple as that. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Now back to the show.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Oliver Baker, Assistant Professor of English and African American Studies at Pennsylvania State University, and author of the book No More Peace, Abolition War and Counterrevolution. Thank you for joining us on Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, Oliver Baker.
It's a pleasure and honor to be here, and I'm so happy to be in conversation with you.
Ditto. So why did you produce this book?
I composed this book for a couple different reasons. I think one of the main reasons is kind of looking back at the kind of a long history of the abolition movement, and kind of really focusing on what I kind of consider a certain strategy of that movement that I think is more organized and more centralized in the antebellum period that we see, but the abolition war as a strategy. So I was really kind of going back and trying to look at like this strategy and its sort of role as a motor force of history. And so I go back and I look at these kinds of moments of enslaved rebels and abolitionists kind of taking up a strategy, not just of trying to create policy changes or reform or even, making more humane this kind of U.S. project, but a strategy of using war to end the war that was slavery against Africans. And so I kind of went back and looked at that history and thought, how is this a motor force in this moment? And that kind of led me to really, in many ways, the book is indebted to your work, Professor Horne, a lot, right? Where it takes up a similar kind of argument of if it's actually, the enslaved and the colonized waging this kind of strategy of war that prompts or compels white settler society to construct and develop these strategies of counter-revolution to stop those revolutions, stop that kind of strategy. So that's what I was kind of looking at with this book was, what can that strategy and those who carried out that strategy, what can they teach us about U.S. society? And one of the themes I try to highlight is that, who better knows how capitalism, counter-revolution, whiteness, slavery, settler colonialism, who better knows how those things work than those who confronted it through this kind of confrontational armed strategy. I see them as like the foremost theoreticians of these kinds of systems. So a part of the project was trying to learn, what do we learn from those people, and which oftentimes are overlooked and not really seen as theorists in that way. People like Harriet Tubman, people like Osborne Anderson, who was a part of John Brown's militia, John Brown himself, people like Nat Turner, the Seminoles and others who kind of waged this strategy. How do we learn from them as theorists of capitalism, precisely because they were practicing a strategy of trying to overthrow it and defeat it. There's more I can kind of say, but I think that's kind of the main kind of way in which I was thinking through, this book.
Now, could you elaborate upon your thesis of abolition war versus constant white counter-revolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes I think the studies of slavery and capitalism, especially, I think some of these approaches that are taken that don't center class struggle, oftentimes we look at like capitalism and slavery and settler colonialism and even imperialism as kind of already made or already formed systems that are imposed on the people they oppress. But the way I was thinking about this book and this approach is, what if we actually look at this history and we begin with those who are resisting? If we begin with those who are engaging in class struggle, like that's like the main actor, that's the motor force, as I was saying. And so I kind of understand abolition war as, those who reached a point where they understood that it would take force to end the force that was upholding slavery, that was upholding colonialism, that's upholding a class society of capitalism. And so, looking at that as like a social movement, but particularly a particular kind of, strategy of that social movement, rather than just only think of it in terms of like frameworks of civil rights and these other kinds of things that we're trying to redeem or reform the American project. But abolition war was actually waged by workers, by the colonized, by the enslaved, as a way to overthrow class society in the way I'm looking at it, what I've kind of uncovered, and to win a future of collective life, And I think there are different stages that would have to go through, but I think that's what they're after. And so I think, the relationship between abolition war and white counter-revolution is conjured up by abolition war, right? Where you see counter-revolution, where you see repression, is because there's militant resistance calling that into existence. It's one of the arguments I'm trying to make, rather than it's just being a one-sided thing being opposed, but it's actually in response. And I do kind of point out too that it's reactive. Counter-revolution in this sense is reactive, but it's also anticipatory. They're trying to organize militias and policing, and they're trying to get all the most widespread participation among Europeans, to all come together to do this kind of counter-revolutionary work to stop this strategy of abolition war, because they know this strategy has teeth to it, that has force behind it, has power behind it, and then it could bring this whole American project, to its knees at this time. So I think that's how I'm kind of looking at the relationship between abolition war and white counter-revolution. Is we have to first see abolition war as the motor force that calls into existence white counter-revolution.
Now, of the insurrections and revolts and armed campaigns of the enslaved and the colonized that you depict, which stand out in your mind as being illustrative of the themes of your book and or the trajectory of U.S. history?
Yeah, that's another great question. There's a few moments in the book, or I kind of consider them flashpoints I try to focus on, and obviously, there's not enough time today to kind of go over all of them, and I would just, I guess, people can check out the book for the full version. But I would say a couple off the top of my head, I think in the background, a lot of this is the Haitian Revolution, and maybe we can even return to that and talk about it. But a couple others are the Stono Rebellion, and I know in your book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, you have a chapter on this that I'm indebted to. But I think the Stono Rebellion in 1739, the Carolinas, was very important, I think, for serving, like I was saying, like a motor force, like the enslaved rebels rebelling there, really prompt and compel the white ruling class to develop like what I call white alliance policing. And it's this kind of widespread cross-class, across difference strategy among Europeans to police the enslaved, and they create a lot of these kind of laws and codes following the Stono Rebellion that like solidify and codify, this white alliance policing as I see it. And then another event, I think, this is obviously a very famous event, but I kind of return to it and do a little, I think I see a kind of a fresh reading of it, but Nat Turner's insurrection was also very, very important in this history, in 1831. And, this was an event where he, his insurrection just terrifies the white ruling class. I mean, it almost compels them to abolish slavery in Virginia. And again, though, in response, so that on the one hand catalyzes more militant abolitionism, it catalyzes the abolition war strategy. A John Brown and a Harriet Tubman really take up that strategy that Turner was trying to develop, and they try to expand it and centralize it. But on the other hand, it compels and again conjures up more white counter-revolution. So they go to work to fortify white alliance policing. They go to work to kind of fortify the ways in which they need everybody on board to stop Black revolution embodied in these kinds of insurrections. And I would say, just to kind of, and a couple more in my chapter 2, I do focus on the Second Seminole War, which was really a very, I think it's often overlooked moment in U.S. history, particularly like antebellum American history. But this was a moment in the 1836 to 1842 when the Seminoles actually created a kind of a united front with Black Seminoles as well as Black Maroons in Florida, and they fought against the ways in which the U.S. government, through Andrew Jackson's administration, was trying to displace and force them to lands west of the Mississippi. And they basically said, no, we're not going anywhere. And they took up abolition war or anti-colonial war in this situation and fought, very courageously and fearlessly. And it raised the cost so much that eventually, the settler ruling class in Florida gave up and conceded a land base to the Seminoles to this day, right? It kind of carries on, right? There's Seminole nations that draw back to this very history where they were not removed. And I think I kind of end the book a little bit with thinking through the way that John Brown is learning from Black radicals, is learning from those who have already waged abolition war strategy. And this is where he comes into conversation and meets up and begins to plot and plan with Harriet Tubman and other people. But I sort of see this as a moment they're trying to centralize and expand and really kind of turn abolition war into a more formal military protracted struggle that would end up, defeating slavery through war. But then also, I argue, that would also be a blow or attack on class society itself, on which slavery rested. And so it was these kind of revolutionary openings. It was a very important moment. And of course, that culminates with Harper's Ferry raid in 1859. But I kind of look at it more as like a centralizing strategy. And I actually make this point that we might even look at John Brown and Harriet Tubman as a precursor to the way that later, like Lenin is thinking of a party formation where they had like John Brown has a provisional government that he's trying to use to centralize his strategy. So, one of the arguments I'm kind of trying to show is, what would history look like, or what does this kind of look like if a 1917 in Russia had happened in 1859, in the United States? And I know there's a novel on this called Fire on the Mountain that thinks through an alternative history, but I kind of tried to kind of take that approach a little bit of, I think that these were leaders and thinkers that were serious about revolution and waging it through this abolition war strategy to get to something beyond class society.
And we're going to take a brief pause on our interview for our Fund Drive highlight with our brother Gary Baca before we return to our interview with Oliver Baker. Take it away, Gary.
818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. We're in our spring fund drive, and we're asking you to go to your phones for Freedom Now, which is on right now, and you support shows like Democracy Now! So do it now. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, or pledge securely online at kpfk.org. We are in our spring fund drive, and if you didn't know, we are raising funds for this radio station so we can stay on the air and bring you the news, views, progressive issues that we have on the table. Just recently, we broadcasted Bernie Sanders and AOC live in Los Angeles. It was a 3-hour event right here on KPFK. So if you appreciate the programming that we offer here at KPFK, then call and pledge your support. We stay on the air because of you. We are on the air because of funds donated by you. We are listener sponsored, which we don't accept any commercials, any ads, and we stay progressive and we stay independent. 818-985-5735. People-powered radio, independent media. It's so important these days. Of course, the Trump administration would like to shut us down, but if they cut the funds, which is the public broadcasting funds, it could affect us. But because of listeners and listener-sponsored radio, we stay this way, so that way, if anything happens to our budget, our funds, the foundations, they stop giving to community radio, then we can stay on the air. We just recently sold our building just to pay the bills so we could be bill-free, which it really isn't like that. Bills keep coming in and we still have to pay them. And that's where your dollars go, that we stay on the air, we stay relevant to you, and we give you the news and views that you know that you need to have. If something happens around the world, we want to know about it. So that's why you tune in to Background Briefing, Tom Hartman, or Democracy Now!, even the KPFK Evening News. But you got shows like this, Freedom Now, with Dr. Gerald Horne, who is a book writer, who is very knowledgeable about the early days of colonialism. He talks about what's going on in Washington and Congress. Dr. Horne is such a treasure when it comes to knowing more about what's going on. Freedom Now is a Pan-African internationalist world affairs program supporting all indigenous and oppressed peoples worldwide. If that doesn't say it for you, what does? 818-985-5735. What does it take to get you to your phone to pledge your support for this program? Does it take us being off the air for a week because we can't pay our bills? Or maybe our transmitter goes down and we're not able to fix it for about a week, which has happened this year and last year. So folks, if you believe in community radio, free speech radio, hands off our democracy, call now at 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Shout outs to the volunteers here at KPFK who actually were able to get a signal from the Fighting Oligarchy tour and plug right into the board, and were able to broadcast this special event for our KPFK listeners. And the great thing about it is KPFA in Berkeley was not broadcasting this, but a lot of people in the Bay Area heard about this and they tuned in to KPFK. So it's a resource for all, and pledge your support for the folks that cannot pledge at all to this radio program. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Now back to Freedom Now and Dr. Gerald Horne. Don't forget 818-985-5735 or pledge securely online at kpfk.org to support this program and the many programs here on KPFK.
And now we return to our interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Dr. Olive Baker about his book, No More Peace, Abolition, War, and Counterrevolution.
You mentioned Harriet Tubman. Talk to us about who she was and elaborate on the role she plays in your pages.
Yeah, Harriet Tubman is very, very important in this book, in this story. In many ways, she was a leader to John Brown, and this is what I highlight. I think he gets a lot of attention, obviously for very good reasons, but in many ways, I see her as a military and political theorist and leader in the abolition war strategy. And really, she becomes this through practice, through militant practice. So she liberates herself and then, finds herself in northern cities like Philadelphia, for example. And she kind of uses these, cities as kind of rear bases in a military sense. I know there's a theorist, Butch Lee, that I highlight here that I think comes up with this term is very important. But, it's through practice of doing these raids into the South through the Underground Railroad. And I look at these raids as strikes in two sense of the word, of a blow, like a hit against slavery, but also like a strike in terms of withdrawal of labor. So these raids that she does, and she claims she does 19. Historians don't think it was that much, but I always say sometimes clandestine activity can't be recorded, so I take her at her word that maybe she did 19 raids, but these were military raids. These were excursions, guerrilla warfare kind of tactics into enemy territory of slavery. And there are rehearsals for a larger abolition war. And I think that John Brown sees that. He knows her reputation. He knows that she knows how to invade and attack and go on the offensive against slavery. And, he had done some of that work in Kansas already in 1856 and on, where he had gone on the offensive. I mean, it's a defense against slavery by going on the offensive in Kansas territory with his militia that he formed out there. But he's trying to centralize his strategy, and he sees Harriet Tubman as a key to this because she's already sort of proven herself to be one of the most effective military leaders going on the offensive against slavery. And so this is where he meets with her in Canada West, along with Martin Delany, along with other abolitionist leaders, and they convene the Chatham Convention. Of course, Tubman isn't at that convention, but this is a part of his trip in 1858 to kind of recruit and bring together more leaders around this strategy. And so actually, John Brown and Harriet Tubman, they co-plan the Harper's Ferry raid. And you can see, her influence in the Harper's Ferry raid if you go back and just look at how she carried out her raids into Maryland and other areas in the South. And so I really see her role, I try to surface her role with the Harper's Ferry raid just by getting us to see her important role in the overall abolition war strategy. And I have a moment too where I reflect on her work in the Combahee River raid, later into the Civil War. And what's interesting is she actually, she's sent down there by the Union Army, because the Union Army at this point is facing defeat, they're facing losses. They're forced to turn to this abolition war strategy that a few years before they had looked at as, that they were never going to take up. But they're forced to turn to this, and so when they're forced to turn to this, they passed the Emancipation Proclamation 1863. They begin to recruit black soldiers and black leaders, and one of the people they recruit and ask for help is Harriet Tubman, and she's down at the Combahee River, or she's in the Carolinas, and she's asked to kind of lead this kind of raid that's very important in a military sense along the Combahee River to attack enemy infrastructure, plantations, and these kinds of things. And she actually selects Colonel Montgomery, who had worked with John Brown in Kansas, and I read that as her attempt to, work again with a kind of a John Brown trained Abolition War veteran, so to speak. And so I think, she frees 800 enslaved people, destroys plantations, property, does, a lot of money and damages to the enemy, is very successful. And she doesn't get as recognized officially, but everyone sort of knows that she led this. And I think, again, to me, it's very important to kind of think through, like, it's the enslaved rebels, it's the fugitives from slavery, it's people like Harriet Tubman who through practice learned these things, theorized these things, took that theory, and then further sharpened their practice. And that's what's allowing them to kind of be in these positions where they're steering this kind of strategy with much success.
Now, we know that the struggles of the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of the enslaved Africans, can well be grouped with the larger rubric of class struggle. Talk to us about the role of class struggle in your pages.
Yeah. One of the kind of interventions, so to speak, or one of the things I was trying to do here is to use this framework or to center class struggle in this approach to this moment in history. So I think a lot of times the struggles of the enslaved and the colonized, Black Revolution, indigenous self-determination, these kinds of struggles to fight against settler colonialism, to fight against slavery, are often looked at as kind of prehistories or kind of not class struggle proper, right? They're looked at as maybe getting to class struggle proper, where it's more like a European proletariat who then takes that on at a later stage of capitalism. But one of the tasks I kind of set out to do was to say, well, these are also class struggles, even according to Marx and Engels and the way they understand class struggle, that the Abolition War and anti-colonial wars are kind of the sharpest and the highest forms of these kinds of class struggles against a stage of capitalism that, Marx calls primitive accumulation. But really, these are, national liberation struggles that are class struggles. And this is how Marx defines class struggle. It's a war between the oppressed and the oppressor. And so I'm trying to kind of center or highlight or look, like, what does it mean to kind of look at this earlier period as a history of class struggle in North America. And if we see that, we can see that class struggle, again, isn't just one-sided. It isn't just only the oppressed fighting, right? But it's the oppressed resisting and fighting and trying to free themselves from an oppressor class. In this case, these are imperial nations, enslaver nations, settler colonial nations that are trying to seize territory, eliminate people, enslave people, all those kind of inordinate amounts of violence that we know about. But this is a struggle back and forth where abolition war, as I said previously, is an attempt to overthrow the power of those kinds of nations, which then in turn conjures up this white counter-revolutionary infrastructure of a white alliance policing, and elsewhere I call it like a settler mass militarism, where again, like all settlers across class are being united around this goal of repressing and stopping indigenous anti-colonial war. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the stakes of that for me is if you see class struggle kind of playing out at an earlier stage, it lets us not only see that these are ongoing, I think even, today in the forms of national liberation struggles, but it also is to say that, like, it lets us see sort of what these struggles are the motor force for the development of capitalism itself, right? I mean, it's a counter formation. It responds to the resistance of those it seeks to oppress and exploit. So abolition war itself is something that's shaping the development of capitalism to its later stages. And so I think we need to go back and see the kind of origins of that. And I think even the stakes for us today is this kind of question of how does the relationship between national liberation and, what we could call like a socialist revolution, how does that relate? And these are important debates to have. But I think of, most recently the Palestinian liberation struggle and how in many ways it is the tip of the spear right now fighting against imperialism. And that's certainly a national liberation struggle. That's a class struggle. But we have to see how that also relates just to the broader and wider working class, international working class, and its fight against capitalism as a whole.
Now, speaking of revolution, what role does the Haitian Revolution play in your story?
Yeah, and this is a great question. This is what I was kind of saying. Maybe we hope we return to, which is great. While in the book I don't dedicate a lot of pages to it, mostly because I was sort of focused on more the antebellum period in North American context. But it is certainly very important, and it's in the background. I think chapter 1, I do begin looking at the Haitian Revolution as this very important moment that is kickstarting, Black revolution in the Americas in many ways. And so, of course, it has started well before that, right? But this is a moment where enslaved rebels in Haiti escalate, take it up to a higher level of organization, to a higher level of militancy, and turn this into really, the initiation of what I would consider a people's war in many ways. Abolition war to me it's a sort of a people's war. And so the Haitian Revolution was very, very, it's very important in this project because all of the abolition war organizers I study, they're looking back at the Haitian Revolution as what to learn from. Nat Turner, his insurrection is not only inspired, but he's learning from the Haitian Revolution and really trying to kind of bring that kind of a strategy to North America. As well as John Brown, very famously, I consider him, a student of Black study. He was he wasn't formally educated at the highest levels, but he did his homework and went and studied important slave insurrections, important maroon societies in the Western Hemisphere. But one of the events he studied the most was the Haitian Revolution, and he was a student of that. I'm forgetting some of the facts off the top of my head, but I feel like some of the belongings they found in the farmhouse, outside of Harper's Ferry, after he's captured, is a study on the Haitian Revolution. And so, Harriet Tubman as well, and these other kind of abolition war theorists and thinkers and organizers and leaders are learning from the Haitian Revolution in terms of strategy, tactics, but just also like how that revolution taught people how to understand the enemy of slavery and the enemy of kind of Western imperialism as it's developing at this time. So I feel like, one of the points is if the Haitian Revolution doesn't happen, it doesn't allow for all these other kind of things to take place in terms of the way people can kind of imagine what could not be imagined, what people can kind of see about the enemy that they couldn't see before, in terms of what strategy, tactics work and don't work, and just what's possible, right? I mean, I always like to think like, when people face incredibly difficult conditions, I mean, we're certainly in dangerous times right now with the rise of, ultra reaction in the White House and just, rising global fascisms that are forces of counter-revolution against progressive movements. How do we go back and look at where people have risen up, have revolted in powerful ways and won and have gained these kind of people's victories? I think that's what was happening in the abolition war, strategy of the antebellum movement. They were looking back to the Haitian Revolution and saying, people have done this in powerful ways. If they can do it, we also can do it.
Finally, Oliver Baker, author of the book No More Peace, Abolition War and Counterrevolution. What's next on your agenda?
Yeah, this is a great question. In some ways, like I put so much focus on this book that I haven't thought about, too deeply, but I am now in the thick of that as well, kind of my next move. And I think I would say I'm really interested in, it's not necessarily even a part two of this book, but it is interested maybe in a part two in terms of the chronology or the next stage in history here. But I'm interested in looking at the Reconstruction era and even after this moment where um, industrialization is on the rise and there are worker revolts, like industrial worker revolts, you know, picking up in the 1870s, 1877, the railroad strike that kind of is national. They pull troops out of Reconstruction to go and contain those revolts. So I'm trying to think through, like, how do we understand the relationship between these rising worker revolts in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and on, but in relationship to what I see as sometimes an overlooked history, especially in the South, of Black militancy and Black self-defense that's fighting against this white ruling class terror that's being unleashed. That's really a counter-revolutionary force, as Du Bois, as yourself, other people have highlighted. This is a counter-revolutionary force to end Reconstruction as a program that was progressive, not just for Black workers, but was progressive for all workers. And so, they're facing white ruling class terror. I think there's like a little bit of overlooked history of Black militancy and self-defense and kind of community defense happening, particularly in the South, that's fighting against that. And I want to kind of look at that, but more in even relationship to like these rising worker revolts in the North, or as well as in the South, and kind of seeing them together. And why that is important to me is because I feel like that's an era that's going to be important to study for helping us figure out right now, how do we have a better understanding of worker struggles today in relationship to national liberation struggles, but particularly like these kinds of united fronts we're going to need to build to fight fascism as it tries to uphold an imperialism that we know is in crisis, that we know is embattled and is lashing out. In many ways, what we're seeing right now is this is imperialism that's being weakened and it's lashing out like an injured, monster that it is. And so although it's doing a lot of damage, we should see that it's not in the best position. And so when the enemy's weakened, you got to go on the attack. And so I think this is an era, for me at least, that we can learn a lot of Black militancy and self-defense fighting this kind of fascism, but also the way that's interacting with, I think, a rising revolt of workers that's happening, that later decades, I think some of that gets co-opted and whiteness comes in and I think peels away a lot of the militancy out of some of those movements. But in this moment, I think in the 1870s, 80s or so, that's not happened just yet. So I think it's interesting for me to kind of look at that era to see what we can learn to help us today.
Well, Oliver Baker of Penn State University, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Ditto.
You are listening to Freedom Now. Freedom Now is a Pan-African internationalist world affairs program supporting all indigenous and oppressed peoples worldwide. 818-985-5735. If you support this program, we support the right to self-determination and seek to provide another point of view, devoid of mainstream media. 818-985-5735. If you support this type of programming with the great Gerald Horne, pledge online at kpfk.org. If you've learned something, if you got something out of today's show, or you've been listening in the past, 818-985-5735. And our sis Tej, Freedom Now, shout out to her for producing this show. And as always, we stand ready for revolution. And that's the motto right here at Freedom Now with Gerald Horne, heard here every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. 818-985-5735. And think about it. If you pledge at any amount, you become a member at $25. You can pledge $50 for this program, $100 for this program, but you keep this program on the air, which is important, that we keep voices that are oppressed, that are going through the struggle and not acknowledged. Indigenous people, immigration rights, and immigration issues. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. We are in our spring fund drive, and what that means is we raise money, and we're good for about a couple of months here at KPFK. But after that, we're back in the struggle again, trying to make it work, trying to make it happen. We really don't have a big staff here. We have a skeleton staff, but what your money goes to is making sure that we keep the airwaves on, that we have the transmitter working so that we can have voices that come on the air, non-paid voices. They don't have a premeditative agenda. It's what's going on in the streets and what we feel. Hands off our democracy. That's the word. Just recently we broadcasted Fighting Oligarchy Tour with Bernie Sanders and AOC. And it was a success. And a lot of us showed up, were there, and a lot of us were KPFK listeners. 818-985-5735. Get yourself a bumper sticker or a tote bag at $50. Or ask the phone room what you can get as a gift. 818-985-5735. 818-985-KPFK. Before we go back to the show, we just want to remind you that in order for us to bring you these types of programming, we ask for your donation during this Spring Fund Drive so we can stay on the air. And we can't help but stress that. It's just as simple as that. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Now back to the show.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is David Eltis, Robert Woodruff Professor Emeritus of History at Emory University in Atlanta, and Adjunct Professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and author of the book Atlantic Cataclysm, Rethinking the Atlantic Slave Trades. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, David Eltis.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Because I spent something like 40 years collecting data on the slave trade, and this data is available to the public at www.slavevoyages.org. It's a comprehensive website on the subject and currently gets about 3,000 visitors a day, and offers far more than the transatlantic slave trade. It includes databases on the Indian Ocean, on the intra-American slave trade, and eventually the intra-African slave trade, as well as details of the people involved. So it's a large and fairly successful project. And the major results became available about 2008 when we first went onto the web. And in the 17 years since, it seems to me that what the site is telling us has not been taken on board by either professional historians or by the general public. So I think that's the short answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Anything else to add about slavevoyages.org that might interest our audience?
It's dynamic in the sense that it's open to public contributions. I don't mean financial. I mean contributions of data. We have an editorial board which reviews any submission. And indeed, that is perhaps in some ways the most successful part of the site, because we have quite a backlog of contributions which have come not just from academics, but from the general public. And we're somewhat behind in editing all this material.
What is meant by the idea that you're offering a 2,000-year perspective on this odious commerce?
Well, I have a long first chapter which introduces slave trading and slavery before the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. That text is the root to my claim to offer a larger perspective. And I do that because I think the transatlantic slave trade was quite unique in history, both in scale, of course, volume, but also in the fact that it, by and large, excluded non-Africans. And for a long period in time, it was actually the source of a much larger group of immigrants, if we can call them that, going into the Americas than was the free migrant traffic from Europe. So from about 1500 down to 1820, we had possibly 4 or 5 Africans carried across the Atlantic compared to a single European, European. So the importance of the traffic, I think, is fairly captured by that statistic.
Now, in light of the fact that the Indian Ocean slave trade is not as well known as the Atlantic slave trade, how would you compare the two? And in your response, could you give us some detail on the scale and volume and chronology of the Indian Ocean slave trade?
Well, I would like to, but it's actually much less well known than its transatlantic counterpart. Some scholars have argued that if you count from, say, the beginning of transoceanic traffic, that's 2,000 years ago in the Indian Ocean or more, the volume of the Indian Ocean traffic was equivalent to the transatlantic traffic. But I don't think that's the case. In fact, most of the Indian Ocean traffic took place in the 19th century. And it was carried on by Arabs mainly. And it never, in my view, came close to matching the size of the traffic to the Americas from the western part of the continent.
Now we know that Zanzibar, which is now part of Tanzania in Southeast Africa, was a major node for the Indian Ocean slave trade. But where were the Africans being transported to?
To the Arab world. It was a sort of, it was a traffic from one part of Africa to another and ultimately to the Red Sea area. There was also a traffic to India. In fact, there is an African population in India, quite reasonably small compared to the Americas, which is the result of that traffic. So it was, I would say, mainly to the Arab north, but also there was some significant traffic to India and perhaps beyond India. Our researches on that topic are still preliminary. We'll have a better idea probably in about 3 or 4 years. But I don't think the big picture will change.
Why 3 or 4 years? What's going to happen by 2028, 2029?
Well, we've got an NEH grant which allows original research into the documents. The problem is, of course, that most of the languages involved are not European, and there are far fewer scholars working on the topic. What we're trying to do is establish a base for future research rather than to do something in the way of overall definitions, which is what we think we've achieved in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Back to the Atlantic slave trade, are there any gender components in terms of the captives who were transported across the oceans during this centuries-long chronology?
The first part of your question, are there any?
Gender, I mean, for example, were there disproportionately women and girls being transported?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, that's a characteristic of slavery before the Atlantic Cataclysm, as I call it, got underway, was that the typical slave was female. But in the Atlantic Ocean, what we get is pretty constant 2-to-1 relationship of males to females. And I think that makes it unique in the annals of slavery, global slavery.
Mm-hmm. We feel, or we suspect, that the Angola-Congo region was a significant supplier of captives and enslaved Africans, particularly to the United States of America. Is that accurate? And if so, what are the other regions of West Africa, perhaps even East Africa, that were suppliers?
Yeah, there was some East African traffic to the Americas. First of all, the U.S. did not draw most of its slaves from Angola. It drew on the Gold Coast and what we call Upper Guinea, Gambia in particular. So this we can say with some certitude. The traffic to the rest of the Americas drew on a wider range of African sources. But overall, you're quite right. I think Angola is or what is today Angola, was the largest contributor, if I can put it that way. And that has to do in part because of population and the ability of the Portuguese in particular to draw on trading routes within that region more effectively than they could elsewhere. Nigeria was also very important. It's not that far behind Angola, what is today Nigeria, that is. We actually have, talk about this later, maybe a second edition of the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade coming out, which pinpoints some of these differences and establishes, I think, pretty clearly that West Africa was almost as important as Angola.
You mentioned East Africa in your response as being a, quote, contributor, unquote, to the number of captives heading across the Atlantic Ocean. Are we talking about Mozambique? Are we talking about Zanzibar? What are we talking about?
Mozambique mainly, because the Portuguese had a presence there, of course, from early on. Probably maybe somewhat less than 1 in 10 of all the captives taken across the Atlantic came from East Africa. And most of those actually came from what's today Mozambique. There was a traffic also, of course, to sugar plantations in the Indian Ocean, in particular the Mascarene Islands, Mauritius, what is today Mauritius, absorbed large numbers of people from East Africa, but never in terms of the numbers that went to the Americas.
Finally, David Eltis, author of the book Atlantic Cataclysm, Rethinking the Atlantic Slave Trades. What's next on your research agenda?
Well, we have, I mentioned the Atlas already. This was published in 2010. It's just called the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. It's published by Yale University Press. And it was fairly successful to the point where the press wants to do a second edition. And I'm working with a co-author on the second edition as we speak. And this will appear probably in maybe November this year. And that would be an updated version of, obviously, the first edition, with particular emphasis on the African component. In other words, we've got ethno-linguistic identities, which we can actually map. And these maps will appear in the second edition.
Well, David Eltis, author of the book Atlantic Cataclysm, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. We're in our spring fund drive, and we're asking you to go to your phones for Freedom Now, which is on right now, and you support shows like Democracy Now! So do it now. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, or pledge securely online at kpfk.org. We are in our spring fund drive, and if you didn't know, we are raising funds for this radio station so we can stay on the air and bring you the news, views, progressive issues that we have on the table. Just recently, we broadcasted Bernie Sanders and AOC live in Los Angeles. It was a 3-hour event right here on KPFK. So if you appreciate the programming that we offer here at KPFK, then call and pledge your support. We stay on the air because of you. We are on the air because of funds donated by you. We are listener sponsored, which we don't accept any commercials, any ads, and we stay progressive and we stay independent. 818-985-5735. People-powered radio, independent media. It's so important these days. Of course, you know the Trump administration would like to shut us down, but if they cut the funds, which is the public broadcasting funds, it could affect us. But because of listeners and listener-sponsored radio, we stay this way, so that way, if anything happens to our budget, our funds, the foundations, they stop giving to community radio, then we can stay on the air. We just recently sold our building just to pay the bills so we could be bill-free, which it really isn't like that. Bills keep coming in and we still have to pay them. And that's where your dollars go, that we stay on the air, we stay relevant to you, and we give you the news and views that you know that you need to have. If something happens around the world, we want to know about it. So that's why you tune in to Background Briefing, Tom Hartman, or Democracy Now! Even the KPFK Evening News. But you got shows like this, Freedom Now, with Dr. Gerald Horne, who is a book writer, who is very knowledgeable about the early days of colonialism. He talks about what's going on in Washington and Congress. Dr. Horne is such a treasure when it comes to knowing more about what's going on. Freedom Now is a Pan-African internationalist world affairs program supporting all indigenous and oppressed peoples worldwide. If that doesn't say it for you, what does? 818-985-5735. What does it take to get you to your phone to pledge your support for this program? Does it take us being off the air for a week because we can't pay our bills? Or maybe our transmitter goes down and we're not able to fix it for about a week, which has happened this year and last year. So folks, if you believe in community radio, free speech radio, hands off our democracy, call now at 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Shout outs to the volunteers here at KPFK who actually were able to get a signal from the Fighting Oligarchy tour and plug right into the board, and were able to broadcast this special event for our KPFK listeners. And the great thing about it is KPFA in Berkeley was not broadcasting this, but a lot of people in the Bay Area heard about this and they tuned in to KPFK. So it's a resource for all, and pledge your support for the folks that cannot pledge at all to this radio program. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Now back to Freedom Now and Dr. Gerald Horne. Don't forget 818-985-5735 or pledge securely online at kpfk.org to support this program and the many programs here on KPFK.
And in closing, we'd like to thank all those who donated this hour, our guests, Dr. Oliver Baker and Dr. David Eltis, our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon, Sister Femi. Thank you, Gary Baca and Wendell Handy, for your support with today's program. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.